Newport, Rhode Island, October 7th, 1966. Outside the gates of Rough Point Mansion on Bellevue Avenue, a 13-year-old paperboy pedals his bicycle toward his next delivery. He hears two people screaming at each other, then silence, then the roar of an engine, a crash, a man screaming in terror. The engine roars again. The man's scream turns to a final, horrified cry. Another crash. The boy arrives at the scene to find Doris Duke, the richest woman in America, standing beside a crumpled Dodge station wagon, staring down at it with cold indifference. Beneath the car lies Eduardo Tirella, 42 years old, her designer and art curator for 7 years, dead. The Newport police chief closes the case in 96 hours. Unfortunate accident. No charges filed. The chief retires 7 months later and buys 2 condominiums in Florida. But this was not an accident. This was murder. And for 55 years, wealth and power kept the truth buried. Until a paperboy, now a Marine veteran, finally came forward with testimony that matches forensic evidence the police ignored, until an investigative journalist spent years reconstructing what actually happened on Millionaire's Row that October afternoon. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of murder, corruption, and how one of America's wealthiest women literally got away with killing someone, if you enjoy true crime investigations that expose how wealth can corrupt justice, consider subscribing to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think should happen when powerful people use money to escape accountability. I'm genuinely curious about your perspective. What follows is the complete story of Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella, the heiress who learned she could do anything, the Renaissance man who tried to leave, the crash that killed him, and the conspiracy that let a murderer walk free. Chapter 1. The richest little girl in the world. To understand how Doris Duke got away with murder in 1966, you need to understand who she was from the moment she was born. Because Doris Duke entered the world as American royalty, surrounded by wealth so vast it literally bought immunity from consequences. She was born on November 22, 1912 in New York City, the only child of James Buchanan Duke and his second wife, Nanaline Holt Inman. James Duke was one of the original robber barons who had built an industrial empire that controlled entire sectors of the American economy. Her father's fortune came from 3 sources. He founded the American Tobacco Company in 1890, and by the time Doris was born, he controlled 97% of all tobacco products in the United States. When the government forced the monopoly to dissolve in 1911, Duke pivoted to hydroelectric power, creating what would become Duke Energy, then expanded into aluminum with major holdings in Alcoa. When Doris was born, newspapers called her, quote, 1 and, quote, 2. Her father's fortune was estimated between $60 million and $100 million, equivalent to approximately $1 billion to $1.8 billion in today's currency, and it was structured to pass directly to Doris. She grew up in what were described as, quote, 3. The family maintained multiple residences, a mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side, Duke Farms in Hillsborough, New Jersey, a sprawling 2,700-acre estate, and Rough Point in Newport, Rhode Island, the English manor-style mansion overlooking the Atlantic Ocean, where 54 years later she would commit murder. Doris's childhood was one of extreme wealth, but also isolation. Her father doted on her, but he also trained her to be suspicious. He understood that immense wealth attracted predators, manipulators, people who would pretend affection to gain access to money. He taught his daughter to trust no one. When James Buchanan Duke died in 1925, Doris was 12 years old. His will left the majority of his fortune to his wife and daughter, but it was his final words to her, spoken on his deathbed, that would echo through her entire life. A 12-year-old girl suddenly possessing unimaginable wealth, told by her dying father to view every human relationship with suspicion. The psychological damage this inflicted cannot be overstated. Doris Duke would spend the rest of her life unable to distinguish between genuine affection and people drawn to her fortune. She became paranoid, controlling, jealous, and increasingly willing to use her wealth as a weapon. Her mother, Nanaline, received only a modest trust fund from James Duke's will. This created immediate tension. At age 14, Doris was forced to sue her own mother to prevent her from selling family assets. When Doris wanted to attend college, Nanaline forbade it. Instead, she took Doris on a grand tour of Europe, presenting her as a debutante in London. In 1930, when Doris turned 18, she was formally presented to society at a debutante ball held at Rough Point. She was 6 feet tall, unusually tall for a woman in that era, striking in appearance, and reportedly worth $40 million in her own name. Every ambitious man in America wanted to marry her. She trusted none of them. To escape her mother's domination, Doris married James H.R. Cromwell in 1935. She was 23. He was 39, recently divorced from Delphine Dodge, heiress to the automobile fortune. Cromwell was suspected of being a fortune hunter. The marriage was cold from the start. They took a 2-year honeymoon traveling the world, eventually settling in Hawaii, but the marriage was already failing. When she became pregnant at age 27, the baby, a daughter named Arden, was born prematurely in July 1940 and died within 24 hours. Doctors told Doris she could never have children again. The loss devastated her. She consulted psychics trying to contact Arden. The Cromwell marriage ended in divorce in 1943. In 1947, Doris married Dominican playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, famous for his sexual prowess and his habit of marrying wealthy women. The marriage lasted barely a year. In the settlement, Rubirosa received a 17th-century house in Paris and millions in gifts. By the 1950s, Doris Duke had developed a clear pattern. She pursued relationships intensely. She showered partners with money and gifts. But the moment they showed any sign of independence, any hint that they might leave her or love her less than completely, she turned vicious. She was notoriously jealous, possessive, controlling, and she had learned, through 2 divorces and countless other incidents, that her wealth could make problems disappear. In 1963, she stabbed her common-law husband, jazz musician Joseph Armand Castro, with a butcher knife during an argument in Hawaii. He sued her for assault, seeking $150,000 in damages. Duke's lawyers and her small army of fixers went to work. Castro was reportedly kidnapped and coerced into dropping the lawsuit. Duke faced no criminal charges. This was who Doris Duke was by the time Eduardo Tirella entered her life. A woman who had learned that wealth bought immunity. A woman whose father had taught her to trust no one. A woman who had shown herself willing to use violence when angered. A woman whose fortune was so vast she was making approximately $1 million per week just from interest on her investments that she could quite literally buy her way out of anything, including murder. Chapter 2. The Renaissance Man. Eduardo Tirella was born on June 8, 1924, in Dover, New Jersey, to an Italian-American family. His birth name was Edward Tirella, but he would adopt the more elegant Eduardo as he moved into artistic circles. This was America between the wars, when being Italian-American still marked you as ethnic, when doors remained closed to immigrants' children, regardless of talent. Eduardo grew up understanding he would have to work twice as hard for half the recognition. He was handsome, classically so, with dark hair, expressive eyes, and the kind of face that photographers loved. He was talented in multiple artistic disciplines. He could sing, he could play piano, he could design. He possessed what his friends would later call an eye for beauty, an instinctive understanding of proportion, color, and style that cannot be taught. But Eduardo's first act of distinction had nothing to do with art. In 1943, age 19, he enlisted in the United States Army. This was World War II. Eduardo volunteered. He fought in the European theater. In December 1944 and January 1945, he participated in the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front, fought in brutal winter conditions through the Ardennes forest. It was one of the bloodiest battles American forces faced in World War II. Eduardo conducted himself with courage under fire. He was awarded the Bronze Star, one of the military's highest honors for valor. When Eduardo returned from the war, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death and survived. He returned to America determined to pursue beauty in all its forms, perhaps as an antidote to the ugliness he had witnessed. In the late 1940s, Eduardo performed at nightclubs in New Jersey, where he became acquainted with Frank Sinatra. Eduardo was openly gay at a time when homosexuality could destroy careers and land men in prison. But he moved through the world with a kind of fearlessness that came from having survived war. He refused to hide who he was. By the early 1950s, Eduardo had shifted his focus to design. He moved to California and became millinery designer and director of hat production for Saks Fifth Avenue in Beverly Hills. This was high-end fashion, serving wealthy clients who demanded perfection. Eduardo excelled. His talent attracted attention from Hollywood socialites and celebrities. He began doing interior design work for private clients. Actress Elizabeth Taylor hired him. Singer Peggy Lee hired him. He designed homes for people who could afford the best and chose Eduardo because he was the best. He was charismatic, cultured, well-read. He spoke multiple languages. He could discuss art history with scholars and Hollywood gossip with starlets. He moved easily between worlds, gay culture and straight Hollywood, working-class New Jersey roots and Beverly Hills luxury, military discipline and artistic freedom. His friends described him as a Renaissance man, someone who excelled in multiple fields, who brought intelligence and creativity to everything he touched. In the late 1950s, Eduardo met Doris Duke. She was looking for someone to help curate her art collection and design the interiors of her various estates. Eduardo's reputation had reached her. She invited him to consult on a project. The work relationship began, and then it deepened into something more complex. Eduardo became Duke's principal designer, art curator, and constant companion. He worked for her for approximately 7 years, from around 1959 until his death in 1966. During this time, he essentially lived at her various properties. Duke maintained 5 major estates: Rough Point in Newport, Duke Farms in New Jersey, Shangri-La in Hawaii, a mansion in Beverly Hills, and a residence in New York City. Eduardo had his own living quarters at each property. He traveled with Duke around the world. His primary role was acquiring art. Duke spent tens of millions of dollars purchasing paintings, sculptures, tapestries, antiques, and decorative objects for her properties. She never bought anything without Eduardo's advice. He would research pieces, evaluate their authenticity, negotiate prices, arrange shipping. He transformed her homes into showcases of taste and refinement. He also designed the gardens at her estates, planned renovations, supervised construction projects, and managed the aesthetic vision for properties that collectively represented hundreds of millions of dollars in value. And Duke paid him modestly. Despite her vast fortune, she compensated Eduardo with what his friends described as, quote, Seven Duke was notoriously stingy. She hoarded money even as she spent it. But Eduardo stayed because the work was extraordinary. He had access to unlimited budgets for acquiring art. He could travel anywhere in the world. He worked on projects that would outlast him. And Duke, for all her flaws, gave him creative freedom. Until he decided to leave. Chapter 3. 7 years of service. The relationship between Doris Duke and Eduardo Tirella was never simple. It was patron and artist, employer and employee, friend and companion, and something else indefinable, a codependency built on Duke's need for control and Eduardo's willingness to endure it in exchange for extraordinary creative opportunities. When Eduardo began working for Duke around 1959, he entered an empire. Duke did not merely own properties. She operated estates that functioned as self-contained worlds, each requiring dozens of staff to maintain, each reflecting her eclectic and often eccentric tastes. Eduardo oversaw all 5 estates. He maintained private quarters at each, not servants' rooms, but proper apartments befitting his status as Duke's principal artistic advisor. When Duke traveled, Eduardo traveled with her. When she decided to redecorate a room, Eduardo designed it. When she wanted to acquire a painting or sculpture, Eduardo researched it, evaluated it, negotiated for it. Duke spent extravagantly on art. Contemporary accounts suggest she purchased tens of millions of dollars worth of paintings, sculptures, tapestries, furniture, and decorative objects during the years Eduardo worked for her. Every purchase required his expertise. He would visit dealers, attend auctions, examine pieces in private collections. He understood markets, authentication, Provenance. Duke relied on his eye and his judgment absolutely, but this reliance bred resentment. Duke resented needing anyone. She resented that Eduardo knew more about art than she did. She resented that dealers respected his opinion. Most of all, she resented any suggestion that Eduardo might have a life separate from serving her. Duke's jealousy manifested in multiple ways. She would monopolize his time, summoning him at odd hours for trivial reasons. She would question him about his friendships, his plans, his thoughts. She monitored his correspondence and phone calls. She made clear that while he technically had private quarters at her estates, she viewed his entire life as belonging to her. Eduardo's friends noticed the toll this took. He looked tired. He seemed constrained, walking on eggshells. When he visited California between assignments for Duke, he spoke about feeling trapped. But he also spoke about the work, the incredible opportunities to handle museum-quality art, to design spaces that would endure, to travel to places most people would never see. Duke's controlling nature extended to everyone in her orbit. Her staff at the various estates numbered in the hundreds: gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, drivers, security personnel, secretaries. All were expected to maintain absolute discretion. Duke paid well, but demanded total loyalty. Stories circulated among Newport society about Duke's temper, her arbitrary cruelty to servants, her willingness to fire people for minor infractions. But beneath the eccentricity lay something darker. Duke's pattern of relationships consistently followed a cycle: intense attachment, possessive control, violent rage when the person tried to leave. Her marriage to Cromwell had ended badly. Her marriage to Rubirosa had ended badly. Her relationship with Joe Castro had ended with her stabbing him, and then using wealth and lawyers to make his assault lawsuit disappear. By the mid-1960s, after 7 years of working for Duke, Eduardo understood this pattern. He had witnessed her rages. He had seen her fire staff members she suspected of disloyalty. He had heard stories about the Castro incident. Friends who knew Duke warned Eduardo, nobody leaves Doris Duke without consequences. But Eduardo had reached a breaking point. He was 42 years old in 1966. He had devoted 7 years to serving Duke's artistic vision. Now he had his own opportunities, real Hollywood work, the chance to build a career separate from being Duke's curator. He had earned the right to his own life. He also had developed a more realistic understanding of Duke's character. The woman was wealthy beyond measure, but emotionally bankrupt. She hoarded money while being surrounded by beauty she had bought, but could not truly appreciate. She commanded armies of servants, but had no genuine friends. She possessed everything except what mattered: human connection, built on mutual respect rather than financial power. Eduardo's partner, Edmund Cara, begged him to simply quit by letter, to walk away cleanly without a face-to-face confrontation. But Eduardo felt he owed Duke the courtesy of telling her in person after 7 years of working together. He would go to Newport for one last project, helping Duke acquire a religious artifact she was interested in purchasing, and then tell her he was leaving. His friends understood that Eduardo was being naive. Duke's ego could not tolerate rejection. Her paranoia would interpret his departure as betrayal. Her wealth and connections meant she could make his life difficult if she chose. But Eduardo had survived war. He had faced German artillery at the Battle of the Bulge. He believed he could handle one aging heiress. On October 6, 1966, Eduardo Tirella boarded a flight from California to Newport. He carried a small suitcase with clothes for a brief visit. He planned to examine the artifact, a reliquary containing bones of a 4th-century saint, make his recommendation to Duke, collect his final belongings from Rough Point, and fly back to California to begin his new life. 24 hours later, his body would lie crushed in the middle of Bellevue Avenue, while Doris Duke stood over the scene with cold indifference. Chapter 4. The Butcher Knife. To understand what happened in October 1966, you need to understand what happened on a night in July 1963 in Hawaii. Because that night, Doris Duke showed exactly what she was capable of when someone angered her, and she learned that her wealth could buy immunity from consequences even for violent assault. Joseph Armand Castro was a jazz pianist and band leader, talented, charming, and significantly younger than Duke. He claimed they had married twice in the 1950s. Duke never publicly acknowledged these marriages. Legal documents suggest the relationships were common law rather than formal. But Castro considered himself Duke's husband. For several years, Castro and Duke maintained a volatile relationship. Duke was possessive and jealous. Castro had his own career and his own identity outside of being Duke's boyfriend. This created constant tension. Then came July 1963 at Shangri-La, Duke's Hawaiian estate. According to Castro's subsequent lawsuit, he and Duke were arguing when Castro apparently joked about Duke's piano-playing ability, a careless comment that triggered disproportionate rage. Duke went to the kitchen. She returned with a butcher knife, and she stabbed Castro in the forearm. The injury was serious enough that Castro required medical treatment. His forearm carried permanent scars from the wound. In 1964, Castro filed 2 lawsuits against Duke. The first sought divorce on grounds that they had been married. The second sought $150,000 in damages for the assault. Castro claimed Duke had tried to kill him with the butcher knife, that the attack was unprovoked and violent, and that the injury had damaged his ability to perform as a musician. Duke's response was methodical and overwhelming. She deployed her considerable legal resources. Her attorneys characterized Castro as a fortune hunter. They attacked his credibility. They disputed the marriages. They minimized the assault. But Duke went further. According to multiple accounts, including testimony that Eduardo heard from Duke herself and relayed to friends, Duke had Castro kidnapped in Hawaii. The details remain murky. But Castro abruptly dropped both lawsuits. On April 27, 1964, Castro appeared without legal representation for a deposition and stated that he wished to dismiss all California actions with prejudice. Duke faced no criminal charges for stabbing Castro. No prosecutor in Hawaii pursued the case. Castro's assault lawsuit vanished. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. Doris Duke could commit violent assault and walk away without consequences. Eduardo Tirella was paying attention. By 1964, he had been working for Duke for several years. He knew Castro personally. They had overlapped in Duke's orbit. Eduardo heard Duke's version of events. Friends later reported that Duke actually bragged about how she had handled Castro, how her lawyers and her money had made the problem disappear. This should have been Eduardo's warning. Duke had stabbed a man with a butcher knife during an argument. She had faced no legal consequences. She had used wealth and connections to silence the victim, and she displayed no remorse, only satisfaction that her power had been confirmed. Eduardo's friends certainly saw the warning. When Eduardo began talking about leaving Duke's employment, multiple people reminded him about the Castro incident. They told him Duke was dangerous. They told him she would not react well to being abandoned. The Castro incident revealed several crucial truths about Duke's psychology and her relationship with the legal system. First, she had a violent temper. When angered, she did not retreat or reconsider. She attacked. The butcher knife was not grabbed in a moment of passion. Duke had to go to the kitchen, select the knife, return to where Castro was, and then stab him. This was deliberate violence. Second, she was paranoid about betrayal. The argument that triggered the stabbing reportedly started with a joke about her piano playing, a trivial matter that Duke interpreted as mockery, which she then interpreted as disloyalty, which she then interpreted as grounds for violence. In Duke's mind, anyone who did not show absolute deference was an enemy. Third, she believed she was above the law, and she was right. Her wealth bought the finest lawyers. Together, they made Castro's lawsuits disappear. They ensured no criminal charges were filed. They reinforced Duke's belief that she could literally do anything without facing consequences. And fourth, she had contempt for people she viewed as beneath her socially. Castro was a working musician. Eduardo was a designer. Both were people she had elevated through patronage, people who owed their positions to her money and favor. In Duke's worldview, such people existed to serve her. They had no rights beyond what she granted. If they displeased her, she could destroy them. The Castro stabbing was a dress rehearsal for what would happen to Eduardo 3 years later. The same pattern: argument, rage, violence, immunity. The same psychology: possessiveness, paranoia, belief in her own untouchability. The only difference was that when Duke turned violent against Eduardo, she would not use a butcher knife. She would use something far more deadly, a 2-ton station wagon. And this time, the victim would not survive to sue. Chapter 5. Breaking Free. By 1965, Eduardo Tirella's Hollywood career was accelerating. After years in Duke's shadow, he was finally building his own reputation in the film industry. And he discovered that working on movie sets, surrounded by creative collaborators, solving design challenges, seeing his work on screen, was infinitely more satisfying than serving Duke's whims. Quote 9. Released in 1965, gave Eduardo his first major Hollywood credit. The film starred Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton at the height of their fame. Eduardo designed Taylor's beach house for the production, a crucial set that appeared throughout the film. Director Vincent Minnelli, who had worked with the best designers in Hollywood, praised his work. The attention to detail, the understanding of how sets would photograph, the ability to create spaces that served both the story and the camera. Eduardo possessed all of it. Taylor herself was impressed. When filming wrapped, Taylor recommended Eduardo to other directors. The film was successful both commercially and critically. And Eduardo appeared briefly on screen in a cameo role, adding another dimension to his resume. He was not just designing sets. He understood filmmaking from inside the production. His next project came quickly. Don't Make Waves, a comedy starring Tony Curtis and Claudia Cardinale, began production in late 1965 and was scheduled for release in 1967. Eduardo again served as set designer and again played a small cameo. His friend Sharon Tate co-starred in the film. On set, Eduardo connected with Curtis and the director. They discussed future projects. Eduardo's phone was ringing with offers. Eduardo was at the perfect age for a set designer. He had accumulated decades of experience in interior design, staging, and understanding how spaces worked. He had traveled the world with Duke, seeing architectural styles and art from every culture. He had managed massive budgets and complex projects. All of this translated directly to film work, where designers needed to create believable spaces on tight schedules and fixed budgets. And crucially, Eduardo was openly gay in an industry that, while not exactly accepting, was at least more tolerant than most of American society in 1966. Hollywood had always harbored gay men in creative roles: designers, choreographers, costume designers. Eduardo's sexuality was not an obstacle. His talent was what mattered. His friends noticed the change in him when he returned to California between assignments for Duke. He seemed energized, excited, hopeful. He talked about upcoming projects. He talked about building a body of work that would be his, not Duke's. He talked about finally having autonomy over his own time and career. But Duke was not releasing him gracefully. She increased her demands on his time. She called him at all hours. She invented projects that required his immediate attention. She made clear that she expected absolute priority. His film work had to fit around her schedule, not the reverse. When Eduardo pushed back, Duke would alternate between rage and wounded martyrdom. How could he abandon her after everything she had done for him? Did he not appreciate the opportunities she had provided? Eduardo confided in his partner, Edmund Cara, that Duke was becoming impossible. Cara urged Eduardo to simply quit, send a letter, make it clean, get as far from Duke as possible before telling her. But Eduardo felt he owed Duke more than that. 7 years was a significant portion of his life. He had helped curate art worth millions. He had designed spaces that would outlast both of them. He had been her constant companion through situations both professional and personal. He could not just send a letter. He had to tell her face to face. Eduardo's optimism was naive, but perhaps necessary. If he had fully acknowledged how dangerous Duke was, he might not have had the courage to leave it all. And staying meant sacrificing his own career, his own future, to Duke's insatiable need for control. In early October, Duke called Eduardo in California. She had found a piece she wanted to acquire, a religious artifact at an antique shop in Newport called the Black Cat. The piece was a reliquary dating from 1500 AD, intricately carved, containing bones of Saint Ursula a 4th century British princess who had been martyred along with 11,000 virgin companions. Such reliquaries were highly prized by wealthy collectors who loved the idea of possessing something sacred. Duke wanted Eduardo's expert evaluation before purchasing. Could he fly to Newport for a few days? She would rent a car. They would examine the reliquary together. It would be simple. Eduardo saw an opportunity. He would go to Newport. He would examine the reliquary and make his recommendation. He would help Duke acquire this final piece for her collection. And then he would tell her face to face that he was leaving her employment to pursue his film career full time. He booked a flight for October 6th. He packed light, a small suitcase with clothes for 2 or 3 days. He called Edmund Cara and told him the plan. Cara pleaded with him to reconsider. Eduardo assured him it would be fine. He would be home by October 9th or 10th. They would celebrate his liberation. Eduardo also called several friends in California. Sharon Tate remembered him being excited about leaving Duke, but also slightly nervous. Richard Burton later told interviewers that Eduardo had mentioned going to Newport one last time to settle things with Duke. On October 6th, Eduardo Tirella flew from Los Angeles to Newport. Doris Duke picked him up at the airport in the late afternoon. They drove to Rough Point. The mansion overlooked the Atlantic Ocean from its commanding position on Bellevue Avenue. It was October in Rhode Island. Cool, the leaves turning, the summer tourist season over. Eduardo had stayed at Rough Point dozens of times over the years. He knew every room, every hallway, every piece of art. He went to his private quarters. He unpacked his small suitcase. He prepared for dinner with Duke. And at some point that evening, he told her. The exact words are lost to history, but Eduardo made clear that he was leaving her employment, that his Hollywood career was taking off, that he needed to focus on his own work rather than hers, that he was grateful for the opportunities she had provided, but it was time to move on. Duke's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Servants at Rough Point later reported hearing shouting that night, loud arguments between Duke and Eduardo that continued for hours. Duke's voice shrill with rage. Eduardo's voice trying to remain calm, trying to reason with her. And then Duke's voice again, accusatory, betrayed, vicious. By the next morning, the argument had not resolved. Duke was not accepting Eduardo's departure. She was demanding he stay. She was alternating between fury and manipulation. How could he do this to her? After everything she had done for him, who did he think he was? But Eduardo held firm. He was leaving. He would help her examine the reliquary as promised, one final professional task. And then he was done. Neither of them knew. They had less than 12 hours together. Chapter 6. The last day. October 7th dawned cool and overcast in Newport. Eduardo Tirella woke in his quarters at Rough Point, perhaps hoping that Doris Duke had calmed overnight, that the previous evening's arguments could be resolved professionally, and he could fly back to California with his conscience clear. He was wrong. The argument resumed. Multiple servants at Rough Point later testified that they heard Duke and Eduardo arguing throughout the morning and into the afternoon. The shouting was intense enough that staff members throughout the mansion could hear it. Duke's voice carried particular venom. Words like quote 13 and quote 14 filtered through closed doors. Eduardo tried to maintain composure. He had made his decision. He was leaving. But he had agreed to one final task, examining the reliquary at the Black Cat Antique Shop and advising Duke on whether to purchase it. He would fulfill that obligation, demonstrate his professionalism, and then depart. Surely Duke would eventually calm down and accept reality. By mid-afternoon, they had reached a tense truce. They would drive to the Black Cat together. Eduardo would examine the piece. They would discuss it. And then they would return to Rough Point, where Eduardo would collect his remaining personal belongings and arrange transportation to the airport. Duke had rented a car specifically for this errand. A Dodge Polara station wagon from the local Avis dealership. It was a large vehicle, heavy, powerful. The Polara was one of Dodge's full-size models. Weighing approximately 2 tons, not the kind of car Duke typically drove, but suitable for transporting a large religious artifact if they decided to purchase it on the spot. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Eduardo and Duke left the main house at Rough Point and walked to where the station wagon was parked. Eduardo got behind the wheel. Duke sat in the passenger seat. The drive to the Black Cat would take only minutes. Newport is a compact city, and everything on Bellevue Avenue is close together. Eduardo started the engine and began driving down the long gravel driveway that led from the main house toward the estate's gates. The driveway was several hundred feet long, lined with mature trees curving gently through the grounds. The gravel surface crunched under the Polara's heavy tires. As they approached the gates, Eduardo could see them ahead. Massive wrought iron structures, ornate, heavy, designed to impress and to secure. They opened inward toward the estate, which meant they had to be fully open before a car could pass through. They were too wide for someone in a car to reach from the driver's seat while the vehicle was positioned to drive through them. Eduardo stopped the station wagon about 15 feet short of the gates. He put the car into park. He engaged the parking brake. He left the engine running. This was standard procedure, as he would need to drive forward once the gates were open. He opened his door and stepped out of the car. He walked to the gates and began unlocking them. This was routine. He had done it dozens of times over the years. The gates were heavy but moved smoothly on their hinges once unlocked. Eduardo pushed them open, creating a clear path for the station wagon to drive through onto Bellevue Avenue. The street was quiet. October in Newport, past tourist season, approaching dinner time. Occasional traffic, nothing unusual. Eduardo began walking back toward the driver's side of the Polara. And then Doris Duke moved. She slid from the passenger seat into the driver's seat. She released the parking brake, not with the foot pedal, but by pulling the hand release. She shifted the transmission from park into drive. She placed her foot on the accelerator, and she slammed it to the floor. The rear tires of the 2-ton station wagon spun violently in the gravel, digging deep gouges, 1.5 inches deep, 30 feet long. The car exploded forward from a dead stop. The acceleration was massive, deliberate, unmistakable. Eduardo, walking back toward the driver's door, heard the engine roar. He turned. He saw the Polara hurtling toward him. He had perhaps 1 second to react. He jumped. His instinct was to leap upward and forward, trying to get on top of the hood, trying to avoid being crushed under the wheels. He managed it partially. His body landed on the hood of the accelerating wagon. His face pressed against the windshield. Through the glass, inches away, he could see Doris Duke behind the wheel, staring at him. The Polara burst through the open gates with Eduardo on the hood. The impact of passing through the gates at high speed shook him. He clung to the hood, terrified. He was screaming. Witnesses would later remember that scream. Raw, desperate, a man who suddenly understood he was about to die. And then Duke hesitated. Sergeant Fred Newton, the Newport Police Department's chief accident investigator, would later conclude based on forensic evidence that Duke tapped the brakes at this moment. The car decelerated slightly. Eduardo rolled off the hood onto Bellevue Avenue. He landed hard. His right hip fractured on impact. But he was alive. He was lying in the middle of the street, broken and bleeding, calling out to Duke, "Doris! Doris!" Several seconds passed. Duke sat in the driver's seat, engine still running, Eduardo on the ground in front of the car. This was the moment. She could stop. She could call for help. She could claim the acceleration had been accidental. And now that Eduardo was off the hood, the danger was over. She did not stop. She decided to commit. Duke pressed the accelerator again. The Polara roared forward. The front wheels rolled over Eduardo's body, then the rear wheels. The 2-ton vehicle crushed him, dragging him under the chassis, across Bellevue Avenue toward the opposite side of the street. The screaming changed. It became a cry of horror, of understanding, of final desperation. No! Then it stopped. The Polara crashed through a post and rail fence on the far side of Bellevue Avenue, demolishing 20 feet of fence. It smashed into a tree with enough force to crumple the front end. The engine finally died. The car settled, front end crushed against the tree trunk. Beneath the rear wheels, Eduardo Tirella lay motionless. His spinal cord was severed, his lungs were hemorrhaging, his brain was bleeding from massive trauma. Death was instantaneous from the moment the car rolled over him. Doris Duke sat in the driver's seat, uninjured. She stared down at the steering wheel, and then she opened the door and stepped out of the car. She walked around the crumpled vehicle, looked down at the body beneath it, and stood there waiting, waiting for someone to arrive, waiting to see if she could get away with murder. Chapter 7. The Paperboy. Bob Walker was 13 years old in October 1966. He had a paper route for the Newport Daily News, delivering papers to homes around the Bellevue Avenue area, Millionaires Row, where America's wealthiest families maintained their summer estates. It was good money for a teenager. The residents tipped well, especially around the holidays. On that October afternoon, Bob was on his bicycle, papers loaded in his delivery bag, working his route. It was late afternoon, approaching 5 o'clock. He was pedaling along Ledge Road, which ran parallel to Bellevue Avenue, 1 block north. His route required him to turn onto Bellevue to make deliveries to the mansions there, including Rough Point, where the richest woman in America lived. As Bob approached the corner where Ledge Road met Bellevue Avenue, he heard voices, a man and a woman arguing. The voices were coming from the direction of the Rough Point gates about 100 feet away. Bob slowed his bicycle, listening. The arguing was loud enough to carry clearly through the quiet October air. Then the arguing stopped. Just stopped, suddenly, mid-conversation. A couple of seconds of silence. Then Bob heard the roar of a motor, not a normal engine sound, a roar, an engine being pushed hard, racing. Then a crash, metal hitting metal, then a man screaming. Bob pedaled faster toward the corner. He could hear more. A slight skidding sound, the engine decelerating slightly, a pause in the screaming. Then the man began screaming again. Then the engine roaring again, even louder. Then the man's scream changing, turning to absolute horror. Quote 17. Then another crash, louder, the sound of metal crumpling and wood splintering. Bob reached the corner of Bellevue Avenue and turned. He could see wreckage across the street. A large station wagon had crashed through a fence and into a tree. The front end was crumpled. The car was canted at an angle, and something was beneath the rear wheels. Bob rode his bicycle across Bellevue Avenue toward the scene. As he got closer, he could see it was a body under the car, a man, not moving, and standing beside the car, staring down at it, was a woman. She was well-dressed, middle-aged, composed. She stood with her arms at her sides, making no move to help, not calling for assistance, just standing there looking down at the car and the body beneath it, with what Bob would later describe as complete indifference. Bob got off his bicycle. He was 13 years old, a paper boy, suddenly confronted with a woman and what appeared to be a terrible accident. But something felt wrong. The woman was not acting like someone who had just been in a car crash. She was not panicked. She was not crying. She was not doing anything except standing there. Bob approached her. The woman's head snapped towards him. Her expression changed from blank indifference to anger. She stepped toward him, moving her body to block his view of the car. "Get out of here!" she shouted at him. Bob was confused. "But ma'am, I can help." "Get out of here!" she screamed again, louder. Bob hesitated. He was a polite kid, raised to respect adults, especially wealthy adults in a town where his family depended on tips and goodwill from the rich summer residents. But his instinct told him something was very wrong. "Ma'am, someone's hurt." "Get out!" she screamed a third time, her voice shrill with rage. Bob backed away. He got on his bicycle. He rode quickly away from the scene, back toward Ledge Road, back toward home. His heart was racing. The image was seared into his memory. The crumpled car, the body underneath, the woman standing there with no emotion except anger at being witnessed. Bob rode home and immediately told his father what he had seen. His father, Bob Walker Sr., listened to the story with growing concern. He knew exactly who lived at Rough Point. Everyone in Newport knew. Doris Duke, the richest woman in America. Dangerous, powerful, vindictive. Bob's father made a decision that would haunt his son for 55 years. He told Bob never to speak of what he had seen, never tell anyone, never go to the police. Because, his father explained, quote 24, quote, his father was genuinely afraid that Doris Duke would have Bob killed to eliminate the only witness to what had happened. So Bob stayed silent. A 13-year-old boy who had heard the argument, heard the two distinct engine roars, heard the man's final scream, seen Duke's indifference. He stayed silent because his father feared for his life. But Bob did not forget. The events were seared into his memory. Every detail remained vivid. The sounds in precise sequence, the sight of the woman blocking his view, the rage in her voice when she screamed at him to leave. Years later, Bob Walker joined the United States Marine Corps. He served honorably, eventually achieving positions requiring top-secret security clearance. He became the kind of man whose word meant something, whose integrity was unquestioned. And during his time in the Marines, stationed at Marine headquarters in Washington, D.C., he shared the story with a small circle of trusted friends. In 1973, 7 years after witnessing the crash, Bob told two fellow Marines what he had seen, Tim Moore and Paul Gall, both of whom would later retire as distinguished officers, heard Bob's account. Both would later confirm that Bob's story never changed, never varied in any detail. If Bob Walker told you something, they said, quote 25. Bob also told several of his oldest Newport friends over the years, always swearing them to secrecy, always explaining his father's fear. He told his younger brother. Each person who heard the story recognized its significance. Bob had witnessed a murder. But Doris Duke was so powerful, so wealthy, so protected, that even after decades, Bob feared coming forward. Then in February 2021, Bob Walker read a book, Homicide at Rough Point, by Peter Lance, an investigative journalist who had spent years researching Eduardo Tirella's death. Lance had uncovered forensic evidence that contradicted the official quote 27 story. He had interviewed witnesses. He had interviewed witnesses. He had obtained documents that had been hidden or quote 28 from official archives. And as Bob read Lance's account, he realized with shock that Lance's reconstruction, based entirely on forensic evidence and interviews with investigators, matched exactly what Bob had seen and heard. The two engine roars, the pause in between, the man on the hood, the deliberate decision to run him over. Everything synced. Bob made a decision. He was 68 years old. His father had been dead for years. Doris Duke had been dead since 1993. The fear that had kept him silent for 55 years was no longer rational. The man who had been killed deserved justice. The truth deserved to be told. On July 2, 2021, Bob Walker walked into the Newport Police Department. He asked to speak to Detective Jack West, the cold case detective. He sat in an interrogation room and for the first time in 55 years gave an official statement about what he had witnessed. He told her everything, the argument he had heard, the sequence of sounds, the two impacts, the man's scream of horror. Duke's indifference, her screaming at him to leave. His father's fear. He gave Detective West the names of the Marines and friends he had told over the decades, people who could corroborate that he had been telling the same story since the 1970s. The next day, Bob attended a book signing at the Brenton Hotel in Newport, where Peter Lance was promoting his book. Bob approached Lance and told him, "I just read your book. Not only was your account of the murder 100% consistent with what the police sergeant who investigated concluded, but I was there. I heard the entire lead-up to the crash, and I confronted Doris Duke seconds after it when she jumped out of the car and was staring down at it, in cold blood." On July 4th, Lance took Bob Walker back to Rough Point. They stood at the corner of Ledge Road and Bellevue Avenue. Bob explained exactly what he had seen and heard from that vantage point. Lance recorded interviews, documenting every detail. Bob's testimony was clear, consistent, credible. On August 2nd, 2021, the Newport Police Department officially reopened the investigation into Eduardo Tirella's death. Detective West sent an email stating, "I am now assigned to follow up with this case, and it's not going to be ignored. This case is now open for further review due to new facts coming forward. The Newport Police Department would like to look further into this due to the new information we've been given and rectify any possible misinformation concluded in the past, if any. I would love to bring justice for Eduardo and his family." Bob Walker had finally broken his silence. The paperboy had become the witness, and for a brief moment, 55 years after the murder, it seemed possible that justice might finally be served and the historical record corrected. Chapter 8. 96 Hours. The first police officer to arrive at the scene was Patrolman Edward Angel. He was nearby when the call came in about a car crash on Bellevue Avenue near the Rough Point gates. He arrived within minutes of the impact, perhaps 2 or 3 minutes after Doris Duke had climbed out of the crumpled station wagon. Angel found the Dodge Polara crashed into a tree, front end destroyed, 20 feet of post and rail fence demolished. Beneath the rear wheels of the vehicle was a man's body, obviously dead from the massive trauma. Blood pooled on the pavement. The scene suggested violence rather than a simple accident, and standing beside the car was Doris Duke, composed, unhurt, watching Angel approach. Angel radioed for backup and an ambulance, though it was already clear the victim was dead. Then Sergeant Fred Newton arrived, the Newport Police Department's chief accident investigator and one of its most experienced officers. Newton took control of the scene. He was methodical, professional, trained in accident reconstruction. He began examining the evidence systematically. He looked at the gates first. They had been burst open with considerable force. The heavy wrought iron was bent. But Newton noticed something crucial. There was no blood on the gates, no tissue. No indication that a human body had been crushed or pinned against them. The damage to the gates was from the car hitting them at speed, not from a body being trapped. He followed the car's path backward. Deep gouges in the gravel driveway, 1.5 inches deep, extending 30 feet back from where the car had been parked. These were not tire marks from a car slowly rolling forward. These were the marks of massive acceleration from a standing start, the rear tires spinning violently before gaining traction. He examined the street. In the middle of Bellevue Avenue, approximately 1/3 of the way from the gates toward the tree, Newton found blood and skin, not near the gates, not under the car's current position. In the middle of the street, he studied the victim's injuries. The medical examiner would later document them officially, but Newton could see enough at the scene. All the significant trauma was to the upper body: head, chest, spinal cord. The victim's right hip was broken, but the legs below that showed minimal damage. Reich, if the victim had been crushed against the gates, as Duke would later claim, the injuries would be primarily to the lower body. These injuries suggested something different. Newton reconstructed what had happened. The car accelerated hard from the driveway. The deep gravel marks proved it. The car hit the victim near the gates. The victim went up onto the hood. His position and the trajectory made sense only if he had jumped or been thrown onto the hood, not crushed at the gates. The car passed through the gates with the victim on the hood. Then the car stopped or slowed, explaining the pause witnesses reported hearing. The victim rolled off the hood onto Bellevue Avenue, landing in the street where Newton had found blood and skin. The victim's hip broke in this fall, and then the car accelerated again. The driver made a choice. The car rolled over the victim where he lay in the street, dragging him under the wheels across the remaining distance to the tree. This was not an accident. This was a series of intentional acts. The initial acceleration, the pause, the decision to continue. The final crushing under the wheels. Newton had investigated hundreds of accidents. He knew the difference between a single sequence event, one action leading to an unintended outcome, and a multi-sequence event where the driver made affirmative decisions at multiple points. Newton's conclusion was clear. Doris Duke had deliberately killed Eduardo Tirella. 6 intentional acts: sliding into the driver's seat, releasing the parking brake, shifting into drive, slamming the accelerator, tapping the brakes and stopping, then accelerating again to crush him. But before Newton could file his report, Police Chief Joseph A. Richest took control of the investigation. Richest was a controversial figure in Newport. His connections to organized crime had been an open secret for years. Newport in the 1960s was a city where money bought influence, where wealthy summer residents expected and received special treatment, where police looked the other way when the rich broke rules that applied to ordinary people. Heiress understood immediately what was at stake. Doris Duke was not just wealthy, she was one of the wealthiest people in America. Her lawyers would already be mobilizing. Charging her with vehicular homicide or manslaughter or any criminal offense would require a level of legal battle that a small city police department could not sustain. Duke could hire the finest defense attorneys in the country. She could drag the case out for years. She could make Richest's life miserable, or Heiress could make this problem disappear and likely be rewarded for his cooperation. What happened next was a carefully orchestrated cover-up. Duke was not taken to police headquarters for questioning. Instead, she was driven to Newport Hospital, where she was supposedly being treated for shock from the accident. This removed her from access by state investigators who might have conducted independent questioning. Duke remained at the hospital overnight, hidden away while her lawyers traveled from New York to manage the situation. The assistant county medical examiner who examined Eduardo's body at the scene was Dr. Charles Ricci. Within hours of Eduardo's death, Duke hired Dr. Ricci as her personal physician. The man whose job was to investigate the death impartially was now on Duke's payroll. It was Dr. Ricci who signed the death certificate listing the cause of death as, quote, 32, quote. Duke's lawyers crafted a statement describing what had supposedly happened. She claimed she and Eduardo were leaving the estate to go to dinner. Eduardo was driving. He stopped at the gates, got out to open them, and left the car in park with the parking brake engaged. Duke slid into the driver's seat to pull forward once the gates were open. The car suddenly, quote 33. She hit the brakes but could not stop. The car pinned Eduardo against the gates, burst through, dragged him across the street, and crashed into the tree. This statement became the official version of events. No one questioned why a car in park with the parking brake engaged would suddenly hurry, quote 34. No one asked how a woman sliding into the driver's seat could accidentally release the parking brake, shift from park into drive, and then hit the accelerator hard enough to leave inch-and-a-half gouges in gravel. Most importantly, no one confronted the physical evidence that contradicted Duke's statement. The location of blood and tissue in the street, not at the gates. The victim's upper body injuries rather than lower body crushing. The two distinct phases of acceleration. Sergeant Newton was ordered to revise his report. The evidence suggesting intentional homicide had to be removed. Newton, a career police officer with a family to support and a pension to protect, complied. His official report omitted the forensic details that proved Duke had committed murder. Then Duke's lawyers crafted a 3-page quote 35 that was supposed to document police questioning Duke about the incident. But this questioning never actually occurred. The document was a script, a fabricated cue and a session designed to make it appear that police had thoroughly investigated and found the death accidental. Once this transcript entered the official file, it became the basis for closing the case. On October 11th, 96 hours after Eduardo's death, Police Chief Richest held a press conference. He announced that Eduardo Tirella's death was, quote, 36, quote. He stated that Doris Duke had cooperated fully with the investigation and that no charges would be filed. The case was closed. The speed was remarkable. 4 days from death to closed case. No inquest, no independent investigation, no criminal charges. Just Duke's word, accepted without challenge. Case closed. 7 months later, in May 1967, Police Chief Joseph A. Richest retired from the Newport Police Department. Shortly thereafter, he purchased the first of 2 condominium units in Hollywood, Florida, properties that would have required significant capital. Where that money came from was never publicly investigated. The cover-up was complete. Doris Duke walked away from Eduardo Tirella's body without facing any criminal consequences. Her wealth and the corruption of Newport's police chief had combined to deliver exactly what she needed: immunity from justice. But Duke understood she needed to do more. Newport society was gossiping. People were suspicious. The circumstances were too convenient, the investigation too quick, the outcome too favorable to Duke. She needed to rehabilitate her reputation and ensure Newport's loyalty. 8 days after Heiress closed the case, Doris Duke began making large charitable donations to Newport institutions. Chapter 9. Blood Money. On October 19th, 8 days after Police Chief Richest declared Eduardo Tirella's death an unfortunate accident, Doris Duke wrote a check for $25,000, $235,000 in today's currency, to restore Newport's famous Cliff Walk. The Cliff Walk was a source of ongoing tension between Duke and the city. The pedestrian path ran along the coastline, passing directly beside Rough Point's property. For years, Duke had attempted to block public access, arguing that tourists walking past her windows invaded her privacy. The city had fought to keep the path open. Duke had created barriers and posted, quote, 38 quote signs. The dispute had generated considerable local resentment. Now, days after she had killed her designer with a station wagon, Duke was suddenly contributing a substantial sum to restore and maintain the very path she had tried to close. The timing was not coincidental. 2 weeks later, Duke donated $10,000, $94,000 in today's currency, to Newport Hospital, the same hospital where Duke had been hidden away the night of Eduardo's death, protected from state investigators while her lawyers crafted the cover story. The hospital's administration had cooperated in keeping Duke isolated and inaccessible. Now they received a generous donation. These gifts were the beginning of what would become Duke's decades-long campaign to buy Newport's silence and gratitude. She understood that the best way to prevent anyone from questioning what had happened was to make herself indispensable to the city's economic and cultural life. In 1968, 2 years after Eduardo's death, Duke founded the Newport Restoration Foundation. The foundation's stated mission was to preserve and restore Newport's colonial-era architecture. Duke poured millions into the project over subsequent decades. The foundation acquired more than 70 colonial buildings throughout Newport's Point and historic Hill neighborhoods, restoring them to period authenticity and creating one of the largest collections of 18th-century architecture in America. The work was genuinely important from a historic preservation standpoint. These buildings might otherwise have been demolished or fallen into ruin. Duke hired skilled craftsmen. She funded meticulous restoration work. She established standards that other preservation efforts would later emulate. But the foundation also served another purpose. It transformed Duke from someone the city might want to investigate into someone the city depended upon economically. The restoration projects employed hundreds of local workers. The restored buildings attracted tourists, generating revenue for Newport's restaurants, hotels, and shops. The foundation became one of Newport's major employers and economic engines. This was a quid pro quo, though never stated explicitly. Duke would invest millions in Newport. In return, Newport would never seriously question what had happened to Eduardo Tirella. The city would embrace the, quote, 39 narrative, and anyone who suggested otherwise would be reminded how much the city owed to Doris Duke's generosity. The strategy worked brilliantly. Over subsequent decades, as Newport developed into a major tourist destination, Duke's role as benefactor and preservationist became central to her public image there. Tour guides mentioned her restoration work. Historical societies praised her contributions. The Newport Restoration Foundation became a respected institution, and Eduardo Tirella was erased. His name appeared nowhere in the restoration work, despite the fact that he had been Duke's principal designer and curator. Despite his having devoted 7 years to beautifying Duke's properties, despite his expertise in architecture and design, being precisely what Duke claimed to value in her foundation's work, Duke continued using Rough Point as her summer residence for decades after Eduardo's death. She filled the mansion with art, much of it acquired on Eduardo's advice, selected with his eye and expertise. She entertained there. She maintained the grounds. She enjoyed the same views of the Atlantic Ocean from the same rooms where she and Eduardo had argued the night before she killed him. She showed no remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement that she had killed a man and walked away without consequences. To the extent Duke mentioned Eduardo at all in later years, it was to diminish him, portraying him as merely staff, as someone whose contributions had been minor, as someone easily replaced. Friends who knew both Duke and Eduardo reported that Duke admitted the truth privately. According to multiple sources, Duke told her next romantic partner that she had killed Eduardo on purpose. She reportedly said she had decided to do it in the moment when Eduardo was on the hood, that she had made a conscious choice to roll over him rather than stop. This admission never became public testimony. It was shared in confidence, passed along through whispers and rumors, never documented in a way that could be used against Duke legally. But it reveals Duke's psychology. She was willing to acknowledge to intimates that she had committed murder, apparently viewing it as a demonstration of power, rather than something requiring remorse or accountability. The blood money strategy extended beyond Newport. Duke cultivated relationships with prominent political and cultural figures. She became friends with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, who served as vice president of the Newport Restoration Foundation. She donated to Democratic political campaigns. She supported arts organizations and medical research. She created a charitable foundation that distributed hundreds of millions of dollars. All of this burnished her reputation as a philanthropist and cultural benefactor. The woman who had stabbed Joe Castro with a butcher knife and killed Eduardo Tirella with a station wagon was gradually transformed in public perception into a sophisticated arts patron and historic preservationist. But for Eduardo's family, Duke's transformation meant only deeper pain. They knew their brother had been murdered. They knew Duke had bought her way out of criminal charges. And now they watched her use wealth to rewrite history, to claim credit for preservation work that drew on Eduardo's expertise and taste, to present herself as a benefactor while Eduardo's memory was deliberately erased. The family had one option left: a civil lawsuit for wrongful death. Criminal charges required a prosecutor willing to challenge Duke's lawyers and Newport's corrupt police department. But a civil suit had a lower burden of proof and could be filed by private citizens. In 1971, 5 years after Eduardo's death, his sister brought a wrongful death suit against Doris Duke. The family was seeking not just compensation, but acknowledgement. They wanted a court to rule on what had actually happened. What they got instead was another demonstration of how wealth corrupts justice. Chapter 10. The Trial That Changed Nothing. Eduardo Tirella's family waited for months after his death. They hoped Doris Duke would do the right thing. Perhaps she would acknowledge responsibility. Perhaps she would offer fair compensation. Perhaps some remnant of conscience would compel her to settle without forcing the family through the trauma of litigation. Duke refused every approach. Her lawyers made clear she would admit nothing and pay nothing voluntarily. If the family wanted any acknowledgement or compensation, they would have to sue. The family asked for a modest settlement. They were not seeking to destroy Duke financially. That would have been impossible given her vast fortune. They simply wanted acknowledgement that Eduardo's death was Duke's fault and compensation that reflected his value as a human being and the income he would have earned over his remaining decades of working life. Duke said no. The amount the Tirella family was asking for was, to Duke, pocket change. But accepting their settlement offer would have been an admission of fault. Duke's entire strategy depended on maintaining the unfortunate accident narrative. She could not allow the official story to be questioned. So Eduardo's sister, as administrator of his estate, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in Rhode Island Superior Court. The complaint alleged that Duke's negligence had caused Eduardo's death and sought $1,250,000 in damages, $9.4 million in today's currency. The case took 5 years to reach trial. Duke's lawyers filed motions, demanded discovery, deposed witnesses, and deployed every delay tactic available. Finally, in the summer of 1971, the case went to trial in Providence Superior Court. The trial lasted 10 days. Eduardo's sister testified about her brother's life, his achievements, his character. Expert witnesses testified about his earning potential. At the time of his death, Eduardo had made $43,000 in 1965, $355. 000 in today's currency. He had decades of earning ahead of him, particularly with his Hollywood career accelerating. Doris Duke took the stand. She was forced to testify under oath about her relationship with Eduardo and the events of that October day. She repeated her story. The car had suddenly leaped forward. She had hit the brakes. She could not stop. It was a terrible accident. But under cross-examination, Duke admitted details that undermined her own story. She acknowledged that she always asked Eduardo's advice before buying or planning anything for her estates. This confirmed his importance to her work, his expertise, his central role in her life. It made the timing of his death, minutes after telling her he was leaving, more suspicious. Duke also admitted she had slid into the driver's seat. She had somehow released the parking brake, though she could not clearly explain how. She had shifted from park into drive, though she claimed this happened accidentally. The physical evidence contradicted Duke's testimony. The deep gravel gouges showed massive acceleration, not a car gently rolling forward. The location of blood and tissue in the street showed Eduardo had not been pinned where Duke claimed. The injuries to Eduardo's upper body showed he had not been crushed against the gates. Sergeant Fred Newton, who had investigated the scene, was called to testify, but his official report had been sanitized of the forensic details that proved murder. He could only testify to what was in his report, and what was in his report supported the, quote, 44 narrative that Police Chief Richest had imposed. The jury deliberated. They found Doris Duke negligent in Eduardo Tirella's death. This was a significant ruling. The jury concluded that Duke bore responsibility for his death, but the damages they awarded were shockingly, insultingly low, $75,000. With interest added over the 5 years since Eduardo's death, the total came to $96,000. This would be divided among Eduardo's 8 siblings, 5 sisters, and 3 brothers. After legal fees, each sibling received $5,620, $42,000 in today's currency. Duke's fortune was estimated at approximately $1 billion in 1971. The $75,000 award represented 0.0075% of her net worth. For comparison, when Duke died in 1993, her will left $100,000 to each of her 2 guard dogs, more than all of Eduardo's siblings received combined. The low award reflected Duke's legal strategy. Her attorneys had spent the trial demeaning Eduardo, portraying him as merely an employee, someone whose contributions had been minor, someone who was fortunate to have worked for Duke at all. They minimized his Hollywood success. They questioned his earning potential. They suggested he was a celebrity sycophant, rather than a talented designer in his own right. And crucially, Duke's lawyers emphasized Eduardo's sexuality. He was openly gay, and in 1971, significant homophobia remained socially acceptable. Duke's legal team subtly suggested that Eduardo's life and future earnings were worth less because of who he was. The jury, drawn from Rhode Island's conservative population, apparently agreed. Eduardo's niece, Donna Lohmeyer, watched the trial and its aftermath with horror and rage. Years later, she told investigative journalist Peter Lance, she killed him twice. She destroyed his body and eviscerated his memory. This was precisely accurate. Duke had literally killed Eduardo. Then she had killed him again at trial, using lawyers and money to destroy his reputation, minimize his achievements, and ensure that even in death, he would be treated as expendable. The $5,620 each sibling received was less than what Duke probably spent on flowers for Rough Point in a single year. It was a pittance, an insult, a demonstration that Eduardo's life, to Duke and to the legal system that enabled her, was worth essentially nothing. The Tirella family had won a negligence verdict but lost everything that mattered. Duke faced no criminal charges. She paid a sum so small it was meaningless to her. She maintained the narrative, and Eduardo's memory was thoroughly trashed in the process. Duke returned to Rough Point and continued living there every summer. The estate that Eduardo had helped curate, filled with art he had helped select, maintained by gardens he had helped design, remained her summer palace. She showed no remorse, no guilt, no acknowledgement that she had done anything wrong, and for 50 years, the case remained closed. The official story was unfortunate accident. Eduardo remained erased from Duke's public history, barely mentioned in her obituaries, forgotten by the tourists who visited Rough Point and admired the art and architecture he had helped create. Until July 2nd, 2021, when Bob Walker walked into the Newport Police Department and finally told the truth about what he had witnessed 55 years earlier. Chapter 11. 55 years later. Peter Lance grew up in Newport. Hearing whispers about what had happened outside the gates of Rough Point in October 1966, Lance's father was a reporter for the Newport Daily News, the same newspaper Bob Walker had been delivering that day. In Newport, everyone knew someone who knew something about the Duke case. The rumors never quite died. The investigation had been too fast, the outcome too convenient. Lance left Newport, built a career in journalism, and won awards for his investigative work. He wrote multiple books exposing corruption and intelligence failures, but the Eduardo Tirella case stayed in the back of his mind. In 2018, Lance returned to Newport and decided to investigate properly. He wanted to know, had Doris Duke really gotten away with murder? Could he prove it 52 years after the fact? He began requesting documents, police reports, court transcripts from the 1971 wrongful death trial. Medical examiner's findings, anything that would provide primary source evidence about what had happened. He discovered something shocking. Many of the key documents were missing. The police file on Eduardo's death, which should have been stored in the Newport Police Department's archives, was gone. The transcripts from the wrongful death trial, which should have been in the courthouse records, were missing. Critical evidence had either been deliberately removed or, quote, 49, quote, over the years. But Lance persisted. He contacted surviving witnesses. He found Edward Angel, the first officer on the scene, now retired. Angel was willing to talk. He described arriving at the crash site and finding Sergeant Fred Newton already beginning his investigation. Angel recalled Newton's professionalism and thoroughness, and Angel revealed something crucial. Newton had solved the case within hours. Sergeant Newton had determined, based on the forensic evidence, that Doris Duke had committed 6 intentional acts leading to Eduardo's death. He had documented these findings in his initial report. But Police Chief Richest had ordered Newton to revise the report, removing anything that suggested criminal intent. Newton had complied. But he had told several fellow officers what he had actually found. Lance interviewed other retired officers who confirmed this account. Newton had known it was murder. He had known Duke was guilty, but he had been ordered to bury the truth. Lance also obtained copies of documents that had been preserved outside official channels. The death certificate showed injuries inconsistent with Duke's story. Photographs taken at the scene showed the deep gravel gouges, proving massive acceleration. Avis rental car records showed the interrogatory Duke had undergone as part of their insurance investigation. In that questioning, Duke had made statements that contradicted her later sworn testimony. Piece by piece, Lance reconstructed what had actually happened. The argument at Rough Point. Eduardo getting out to open the gates, Duke sliding behind the wheel. The first acceleration, hitting Eduardo and sending him onto the hood. The brief pause when Duke tapped the brakes. Eduardo rolling off onto Bellevue Avenue, alive and calling out to her. Duke's decision to commit. The second acceleration, crushing him under the wheels. Lance's investigation went further. He uncovered evidence of the corruption that had enabled Duke's escape from justice, Chief Richest's mafia connections. Dr. Ricci, the medical examiner, being hired as Duke's personal physician within hours of Eduardo's death, the fabricated interrogatory transcript, the missing documents, the payoffs. In July 2020, Lance published his findings in Vanity Fair magazine. The article ran 8,000 words and documented the case for murder in meticulous detail. The response was immediate. Readers were shocked. LGBTQ advocacy groups highlighted how Eduardo's sexuality had made him more vulnerable, how homophobia had contributed to his memory being erased. Lance expanded the investigation into a full book. Quote 50 was published in February 2021. 438 pages, 110 images, including never-before-seen crime scene photographs and forensic documents. 60 pages of annotations documenting every claim with primary sources. The book made a definitive case. Doris Duke had murdered Eduardo Tirella with intent. Police Chief Richest had corruptly closed the investigation. Duke had used wealth and power to avoid accountability. Eduardo had been a war hero, designer, and artist whose life and achievements had been deliberately erased. On July 2nd, 2021, less than 5 months after Lance's book was published, Bob Walker read it and recognized that Lance's reconstruction matched perfectly what he had witnessed. Walker went to the Newport Police Department and gave his statement to Detective Jacques West, the cold case detective. The next day, Walker attended Lance's book signing at the Brenton Hotel. He approached Lance and said, "I was there. I heard everything. I confronted Doris Duke moments after the crash. Everything you wrote is exactly what happened." On July 4th, Lance took Walker back to Rough Point. They stood at the corner of Ledge Road and Bellevue Avenue, where Walker had been riding his bike 55 years earlier. Walker pointed out exactly where he had been when he heard the argument, where he heard the two-engine roars, where he saw the crashed car and Duke standing beside it, unmoved. Lance recorded everything on video. Walker's testimony was devastating for anyone still defending the, quote, 52 narrative. He had heard the sequence of sounds that proved 2 separate accelerations. He had confronted Duke immediately after and witnessed her complete lack of concern. He had been ordered by his father to stay silent out of fear that Duke would have him killed. And crucially, Walker had told the same story to multiple people, starting in 1973, long before Lance's investigation. Retired Marine Colonels Tim Moore and Paul Gall confirmed Walker had shared identical details with them. Decades earlier, Walker's brother confirmed he had heard the story. Old Newport friends confirmed Walker had told them, always emphasizing his father's fear for his safety. Walker was credible. His military service, his top-secret security clearance, his reputation in the community, everything supported his reliability. On August 2nd, 2021, the Newport Police Department officially reopened the investigation into Eduardo Tirella's death. Detective West sent an email to Lance stating, "Leno to quote 53. The Associated Press picked up the story. It went global. Dozens of outlets around the world reported that the 55-year-old case was being reopened based on new witness testimony. For Lance, Walker, and Eduardo's surviving family members, there was hope, finally, that the truth would be officially acknowledged, that history would be corrected, that Eduardo would receive justice, even posthumously. Then the Newport Police Department closed the case again. On November 19, 2021, 109 days after reopening the investigation, Detective Sergeant West sent Lance an email. "My conclusion is there is no new evidence that would change the previous conclusion in this matter, nor is there any new evidence that warrants further review." The case was closed. Again. The unfortunate accident verdict from 1966 remained official. No charges would be filed because Doris Duke had died in October 1993. No correction to the historical record would be made. Lance was outraged. Detective Wiest had initially found Walker credible and seemed genuinely interested in pursuing justice. Then she was promoted to sergeant. She left on a 3-week vacation to Europe. When she returned, her attitude had changed. She stopped responding to Lance's emails, providing additional evidence. And finally, she closed the case with a conclusion that ignored everything Walker had testified to, everything Lance had documented, everything the forensic evidence proved. Newport City Council members expressed shock at the handling of the investigation. Council member Kate Leonard stated, quote, 56, quote, Council member Elizabeth Fuerte demanded accountability. Quote, 57. The Newport Police Department's decision to close the case despite overwhelming evidence suggested that even 28 years after Duke's death, her wealth and influence still protected her reputation. The Newport Restoration Foundation, which Duke had founded and which now operates Rough Point as a museum, had a financial stake in maintaining Duke's image as a philanthropist rather than acknowledging her as a murderer. The city of Newport had profited enormously from Duke's restoration work and continued to profit from tourism, driven by the historic properties she had preserved. Correcting the historical record, officially acknowledging that Doris Duke had murdered Eduardo Tirella, would be embarrassing and potentially damaging. So the system chose, again, to protect Duke and ignore Eduardo. Bob Walker, who had finally found the courage to come forward after 55 years, felt betrayed by the Newport Police Department's decision. He told reporters, "I've carried this in my heart for 55 years. It's extremely personal to me. I put my personal reputation at stake to step forward and give this testimony. It wasn't without an awful lot of heartache and thought." Eduardo's family, most of whom had died in the decade since his death, never received the acknowledgement they had sought. But the truth is now documented and preserved. Peter Lance's book exists as a permanent record. Bob Walker's testimony is recorded on video. The forensic evidence has been published. Future historians, researchers, and anyone interested in justice will be able to see exactly what happened and how wealth corrupted every aspect of the case. The official record may still say, quote, 59, quote, but the actual record, the evidence that matters, says murder. Chapter 12. The Palace Built on Blood Today. Rough Point operates as a historic house museum managed by the Newport Restoration Foundation. Tourists pay admission to walk through the rooms where Doris Duke lived, to admire the art she collected, to stand on the cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The tours are professionally conducted. Guides describe Duke's life, her travels, her passion for art, her work in historic preservation. They point out paintings by Gainsborough, Van Dyck, Renoir. They describe the furniture that once belonged to French royalty, the ceramics from China, the tapestries from Belgium. What they say about Eduardo Tirella has changed over time, and those changes tell their own story. For years, Rough Point's exhibit about the incident described Eduardo's death as an unfortunate accident. The text presented Duke's version of events without challenge. The exhibit suggested that, quote, 61 quotes surrounded the incident, but that the official police investigation had determined it was accidental. After Peter Lance's book was published in February 2021, journalists and historians challenged this exhibit. Lance published correspondence with the Newport Restoration Foundation pointing out specific factual errors and misleading statements. In June 2021, the Newport Restoration Foundation modified the exhibit. They changed the description from accident to incident, acknowledging ambiguity without admitting Duke's guilt. They removed the false claim that Duke had, quote, 64, quote, with the Tirella family, which had implied a negotiated agreement rather than the court-ordered judgment for negligence. They reduced the exhibit from 5 paragraphs to 4. But even the modified exhibit fails to acknowledge crucial facts. It does not mention that Duke was found negligent in the 1971 civil trial. It does not mention the forensic evidence contradicting her story. It does not mention Bob Walker's eyewitness testimony. It does not mention Sergeant Newton's initial findings that Duke had committed intentional acts leading to Eduardo's death. The Newport Restoration Foundation issued a statement saying it does not have the capacity or resources to conduct a separate investigation into Lance's findings. This position is absurd given the Foundation's $75 million endowment and the fact that Rough Point itself is the crime scene. But the Foundation has financial incentives to protect Duke's reputation. Rough Point is marketed as the home of a philanthropist and arts patron. Acknowledging that Duke was a murderer who bought her way out of justice would complicate that narrative. It might discourage tourists, reduce donations, damage the Foundation's reputation. So the Foundation maintains a careful ambiguity, acknowledging controversy, without taking a position on the truth. Meanwhile, the art filling Rough Point's rooms, much of it selected by Eduardo, acquired on his advice, chosen with his expert eye, is credited to Duke alone. The gardens Eduardo helped to design carry no acknowledgement of his contributions. The restoration work Duke funded draws on aesthetic principles Eduardo helped her develop during 7 years of working together. Eduardo's fingerprints are everywhere at Rough Point, but his name is almost nowhere. He has been erased, just as Duke intended when she badmouthed his memory at the trial, and just as the Newport Restoration Foundation continues by minimizing his role and refusing to acknowledge how he died. Doris Duke died on October 28, 1993, at age 80 in her Beverly Hills home. Her will established the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation with the bulk of her fortune, approximately $1.2 billion. The foundation continues operating today, distributing grants for performing arts, environmental conservation, medical research, and child welfare. Duke's obituaries mentioned the Tirella incident briefly, usually in a single paragraph, and always repeated the, quote, 67 language. Duke was remembered primarily as a philanthropist, arts patron, and eccentric heiress. Her pattern of violence was minimized or omitted entirely. Eduardo Tirella has no similar foundation bearing his name. His contributions to design, art curation, and historic preservation are largely forgotten. His Bronze Star for Valor at the Battle of the Bulge appears in no museum displays. His work on major Hollywood films earns him no retrospectives. His friendships with Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, Sharon Tate, Frank Sinatra are footnotes in their biographies, if mentioned at all. He died at 42, his Hollywood career just taking off, his full potential never realized. And the woman who killed him faced no consequences. Lived another 27 years in luxury, and is now remembered as a benefactor while he is forgotten. This is what wealth can buy. Not just immunity from criminal prosecution in the moment, but immunity from historical judgment decades later. Duke's money corrupted the police investigation, corrupted the civil trial, and continues corrupting the historical record at Rough Point today. The palace stands, magnificent and cold, on its cliff above the Atlantic. The art glitters in the carefully lit rooms. The gardens bloom according to schedules Eduardo helped establish. And tourists walk through marveling at Duke's taste, her vision, her contributions to preservation. They do not see Eduardo calling out to Duke as she made her choice to commit. They do not see Police Chief Ratties counting the money that bought his cooperation, retiring to Florida condominiums purchased with blood. They do not see a 13-year-old paperboy pedaling away from the scene, terrified, carrying a secret that would haunt him for 55 years. They see only the glittering surface, the marble and gold, the expensive beauty purchased with a fortune built on tobacco, aluminum, and hydroelectric power. The palace stands, but it stands on Eduardo Tirella's blood. Look at the photograph of Eduardo Tirella from the 1960s. He is handsome, elegant, confident. He has movie star looks and an artist's eye. He has survived a war, earned a Bronze Star, built a career through talent and determination. He has every reason to expect a future full of creative achievement. Now look at the photograph of Doris Duke from the same era. She has inherited a fortune she did nothing to earn. She has stabbed a man with a butcher knife and faced no consequences. She believes she is above the law because she has learned repeatedly that her wealth makes her untouchable. These two people existed in the same world but did not exist on equal terms. Eduardo's life could be taken with impunity. Duke's freedom could not be threatened, regardless of her actions. Wealth created this inequality, and wealth sustained it through 5 decades of cover-up, corruption, and historical erasure. The Doris Duke case teaches us crucial lessons about wealth, power, and justice in America. First, extreme wealth corrupts justice at every level. It corrupts the police who investigate crimes, as Chief Richest demonstrated when he closed the case in 96 hours and retired to Florida condos 7 months later. It corrupts medical examiners who accept positions on the wealthy person's payroll while supposedly investigating objectively. It corrupts the legal system where even a verdict of negligence results in damages so low they constitute mockery. And it corrupts the historical record when institutions dependent on the wealthy person's philanthropy refuse to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Second, witnesses to injustice face genuine danger when the perpetrator is wealthy. Bob Walker's father was right to fear for his son's safety. The courage Walker showed in finally coming forward at age 68 should not be underestimated. Third, the pattern of violence matters. Duke had stabbed Joe Castro and gotten away with it. This taught her she could use violence without consequences. When Eduardo told her he was leaving, Duke escalated to murder because she believed, correctly, that her wealth would protect her. So what should happen now? Peter Lance has called for several actions. The Newport Police Department should formally correct the record, acknowledging that the investigation was corrupt. The Newport Restoration Foundation should revise its exhibits at Rough Point to accurately describe what happened, including the forensic evidence and eyewitness testimony proving Duke's guilt. And Duke University should acknowledge the darker aspects of her legacy rather than presenting only the philanthropic side. Will any of this happen? Probably not. Institutions hate admitting they were wrong. Foundations fear damaging their reputations. Police departments resist acknowledging corruption. And wealthy families' descendants protect the family name regardless of what their ancestors actually did. But the truth is now documented. Anyone who wants to know what really happened can read Peter Lance's meticulously researched book, can watch Bob Walker's videotaped testimony, can examine the forensic evidence that proves Doris Duke murdered Eduardo Tirella with intent and got away with it through wealth and corruption. Eduardo deserved better. His family deserved justice. The historical record deserves accuracy, and society deserves to confront how extreme wealth corrupts every system meant to ensure accountability. As long as Rough Point stands accepting tourist admission fees while presenting a sanitized version of Duke's life, Eduardo is still being killed. As long as the Newport Restoration Foundation credits Duke with preservation work that drew on Eduardo's expertise without acknowledging how she treated him, Eduardo is still being erased. As long as the official police record says unfortunate accident, despite overwhelming evidence of murder, Eduardo is still being denied justice. Doris Duke killed Eduardo Tirella 3 times. First, she crushed his body under a 2-ton station wagon. Second, she eviscerated his memory at trial, using lawyers to portray him as worthless. Third, her wealth and influence continue killing the truth today, protecting her reputation at Eduardo's expense even from the grave. The palace stands, but we should never forget whose blood it stands on. We should never stop demanding that wealth be held accountable. We should never stop fighting for justice, even when justice seems impossible. Eduardo Tirella was a war hero, an artist, a designer, and a human being whose life mattered. Say his name, remember his story, and demand that history tell the truth.